Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, and a happy Purim to those in walled cities. If there's anyone here currently celebrating Purim. So, today, in our third of three classes, we're going to learn about the history of medieval Judaism by considering the biblical laws of impurity and their reception in this interesting period of Jewish life. So I would like to begin by doing a little bit of review. In our first class, we talked about Baghdad, the capital of the Islamic world, and we discussed the nickname or the theme of the Renaissance of Islamic life and culture. So if anyone remembers anything about the first class, it would be great to type it in the chat, just so I can see that we're all on the same page, because this class is really going to build on the first two classes. So after entering this souk, or market of Baghdad, with all its spice and diversity, we considered some of the various medieval Jewish groups in greater depth. In the early medieval period, we discussed the reaction to the rise of Islam with these Messianic Jewish groups, which we didn't get into great depth of. We talked about the formation of Jewish groups led by charismatic leaders. For our purposes, the most significant of which was Anan ben David. And I introduced y'all to my favorite medieval Jew, Yaqub al-Kirkasani. And we discussed Kirkasani's importance both as a source book for the beliefs of other medieval Jewish groups and as an incredibly interesting figure in his own right. We ended last class discussing the significance of visual observation of the moon in the polemic between Rabbinite and non-Rabbinite Jews in the medieval period. And we talked about how observing the moon and determining the calendar, the Jewish calendar, had important implications for the communal organization. It determined the days in which various Jewish groups celebrated the holidays. And so it had a massive impact, this issue of visual observation of the moon versus calculating the new month based on a mathematical formula, as is the Rabbinite practice to this day. And in the research of medieval Judaism, the issue of the calendar has received great attention. Today, we are going to consider medieval Judaism and the different Jewish groups by discussing a much less understood and widely discussed issue, I would argue, of tremendous importance, perhaps equal importance with the calendar in shaping Jewish life. And that issue is the biblical laws of purity and impurity. So I invite you all to enter the city walls of Baghdad during the Renaissance of Islamic culture and ask, how can we approach the biblical laws of purity and impurity? How can we see these laws as a framework for understanding medieval Baghdad? So I'd like to begin by asking everyone, we can take one or two shares, and anybody who would like can share in the chat. I'd like to see what preconceptions we have about purity and impurity. What do we associate with this topic of biblical law? Is it something that we have a hard time relating to? I believe the newsletter promoting this lecture had the word filthy in it. And we see that other words associated with purity and impurity can be danger, transgression, disorder. So we have women's issues. That's right on topic as the main issue of purity and impurity that is preserved in the rabbinic Jewish community, which is most of the Jewish community that's existing today, has to do with the menstrual impurities. And many of the other biblical impurities, so we have dead things. Okay. So these are the two subjects that we're going to look at in greater depth today. As you can see here, we have corpse impurity and childbirth impurity. So we have Phyllis mentions food. The biblical laws around food overlap with impurity. As we read in the book of Deuteronomy, there are certain impure animals. Rob mentions the Zav emissions. So the Zav emissions are a kind of difficult to explain, some sort of natural fluid that is a source of impurity, male body fluids. Great. So let's look at purity and impurity a little bit more systematically. So this is just a little bit of background information for those who have not read the book of Leviticus very recently. There are basically two main kinds of impurity. And I should just preface all of my remarks on purity and impurity by saying that there's a difficulty in translating the Hebrew words. What we can say with confidence is that tameh and tahor are opposite states. So if one is tameh, as we usually translate in English, impure, and by definition, one is not tahor, which is pure. And if one is pure, tahor, then one is definitionally not tameh. And we have to bring a lot of curiosity and openness to what these words really mean. And there's a big debate about what they mean. There's a lot of mystery even to understanding the impurity system. And I use the word system very deliberately because it's been argued by Jewish scholars, well before biblical scholars, the impurity and purity laws are very systematic. And to see the full picture, you really need to zoom out and then zoom back in to see the details in their wider context, in their theological context. And in a way, it relates to a wider worldview, a spiritual worldview, and a way of categorizing. And there are obviously anthropological ways of analyzing the purity laws and different comparative perspectives. What we can learn, for example, about Israelite menstrual laws by understanding other groups and their menstrual laws. In what ways is the Torah polemicizing against other cultures and other ways of thinking about death and life and moral? And when I say moral, I'm transitioning us into the second kind of impurity, which we will not discuss today. And this is a moral impurity. So there are really two kinds of impurity that are discussed in the Bible. There are ritual impurities, and these impurities are generally understood as a naturally occurring. So we mentioned menstruation, menstrual blood, the zav fluid, death. These are all natural phenomena, and there's no moral blame associated with contracting one of these impurities. And the book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, also discusses moral impurities. And these are impurities that are related to sin and activities that are considered disgusting. And so just to quickly run through, there are, in the book of Leviticus, a description of all the ritual impurities. And the main ones are related to touching a corpse. And this leads to a whole chain of impurities. So someone who touches something that has been already made impure by touching a corpse also becomes impure. And there are also rules related to carrying impure objects from the source of impurity. And there are various creepy crawly things that if you touch them, you become impure, and things that are touched by it. And there's a very mysterious impurity. Title of the book. I believe I was talking about Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger. That was a question in the chat. There's a very mysterious bodily plague in Hebrew, tsa'arat, often mistranslated as leprosy, which is a naturally occurring condition in biblical times. We're going to talk about here childbirth impurity. So this is an impurity that is difficult, perhaps the most difficult to understand, results after a woman gives birth. And we mentioned Zav and Ziva. And there's also impurity of objects. And we'll skip over the moral impurities because we are not going to get into greater depth of them today. So the two impurities we're going to look at a little bit closer today, we're probably only going to have time to discuss corpse impurity. If we have time, we'll get on to the impurity after childbirth. So corpse impurity is considered the most severe state of ritual impurity because the dead body is the most impure object. And there are various details that reflect the stringency of this impurity, starting that it lasts a minimum of 7 days. And the person needs to leave the camp if they have this kind of impurity. And it's important to note now that there's a whole elaborate purification process from corpse impurity. And it requires the sprinkling of the ashes in the biblical description. The process requires the sprinkling of the ashes of the para aduma, or red heifer, on the 3rd and 7th day, followed by additional sacrifice and purification rituals. And the other impurity that, if we have time, we'll get into a bit more detail, is related to childbirth. And this impurity has difficult, especially difficult for our modern sensibilities. A woman who gives birth remains impure for 1 week upon the birth of a male child, and 2 weeks followed by the birth of a female child, and an additional 33 or 66 days, again, with the same gender difference. So this is one of the more difficult. Even the scholars don't really have a great explanation for this particular discrepancy of 33 and 66. Okay, let's see what Harry adds in the chat. I think the difficult for me is the impurity of what is natural for women, menstruation and giving birth. The word impurity is a loaded word and hard to avoid feeling put down as a woman. The idea that men consider women impure at these times. So that's an interesting reflection. I think that in a way the Torah itself is more egalitarian in the sense that both men and women have these natural impurities, these ritual impurities. The idea that the birth of a daughter doubles the length of time is hard to avoid the discomfort. And that's what we have in our Torah. I should mention that there's a project that I'm writing a paper about called the Regendered Bible, which flips all these laws around. So I would encourage Harriet, if they're interested in what would it look like reading a Torah where men have impurity after giving birth, to look at the Regendered Bible. Moving on to the medieval views on impurity. So for this section, we are going to go to the sources themselves. So this will be something that we haven't done in the lecture series so far, which is we are actually going to look at some Judeo-Arabic texts from the medieval period. So to do that, I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to share a new screen. Everyone can see a page that says 1080 on the top. Everyone can see that. Great. So what we are looking at here is the most important primary source from the period that I've been lecturing about. This is from the book entitled Kitab al-Anwar wal-Marakib, which means the book of lights and watchtowers, authored by Jacob al-Kirkasani, my favorite medieval Jew, approximately the year 930. I say approximately the year 930 for two reasons. It's clear from reading this book that the author continually updated it throughout his life and probably spent many years working on it. And unlike a book today, which is published at one point in time, books in the medieval period, which were handwritten, didn't necessarily have a set publication date. Authors and scribes would feel free to make edits in real time, change things that they'd previously said. So the concept of a finished book that we're used to doesn't exist in the same way. So this author really, it's clear from reading the book, which is 1,278 pages in the edition prepared by Professor Leon Nimoy of Yale University. And the book only came down to us in the Nimoy edition through a process that is worth me devoting 2 minutes of our time to sharing, because it says something about medieval Judaism and its study. And so the story of this book is as follows. When the Cairo Geniza was discovered by modern scholars in the beginning of the 20th century, there were other Egyptian synagogues that also had these hidden libraries, what we call Genizas. And one of those synagogues was the Dar Simcha synagogue in Old Cairo, and this was the Karaite synagogue. And in the Karaite synagogue were found many complete books, unlike the Cairo Geniza and the Fustat synagogue, and the Ben Ezra synagogue, in which we may be familiar with some of its most important findings, such as the Damascus document, and which we're used to seeing a little fragment, half a page here. Whole entire books were preserved in the Karaite synagogue, such as Kitab al-Anwar by Kirkasani. Now, while we were lucky enough to have many partial copies of this book, when it was taken by Avraham Firkovich, a Karaite of Eastern Europe, who traveled around the world collecting rare books, it was unfortunately what were once hundreds of pages together were all shuffled around. So by the time that Leon Nimoy in the 1930s got his hands on photocopies of these manuscripts, there was no order. And so Nimoy spent 20 years, this is why I wanted to mention it, because he spent 20 years of his life putting Humpty Dumpty back together. And I'm really glad that this work has been done so that future scholars like myself have the comfort of reading this book in order. And I would like to mention that I'm part of a group of scholars who are digitizing this handwritten book. So if we look at a page of the book itself, we'll see some Hebrew letters, and these tend to be biblical verses or Hebrew expressions. And we'll also see that most of the book is written in Arabic. And this in itself is an important reflection that when we're studying the medieval Jewish groups of Baghdad, the language of religious discourse is Arabic. And that in itself is important to consider. Okay, in Iraq in recent days, a man did not touch his wife for 40 days. That is interesting. We will touch on that at the end of the class. That's interesting. Very interesting. I assume that Carmen is talking about Orthodox Jews or traditional Jews and not there was a small Karaite community in Iraq. And I assume Carmen is not talking about the Karaite community, but the rabbinic community. Okay. So we are going to learn some of Kirkasani, and this will be something new for me to teach this text to a non-Arabic speaking audience. So what we're going to try, this is an experiment for me. It's the first time, and people can share in the chat if they... I'm going to start by reading the Arabic and translating just to give people more of a taste of what this is. And presuming that the majority of those in the audience are not Arabic speakers, I'll summarize some more of what he's talking about. And people can feel free to ask questions as we go along. And the intention here is that the best way to really get a taste of what life is like in medieval Baghdad is by looking at basically the main surviving artifact, which is this book. We have very little else to know about this period in Jewish history other than the literary sources, unfortunately. Whatever archaeological discoveries could be found in Iraq have been mostly halted by the Iraqi government in the last several decades, so there's not that much ability to find other sources of information, and a lot of it has been destroyed in the various wars. So without further ado, I first want to give people an overall view of the scope of Kirkasani, to know who you are dealing with, who we are dealing with, and why Kirkasani is such an important source on this period. Firstly, because there aren't a lot of sources. So every source that we have from the year 930 in Jewish history is very precious. We don't have a lot of material from the completion of the Talmud in around the 6th century to 930. We don't have a lot of sources from Jews themselves. And this is a very valuable one because he liked to talk and he liked to quote his sources. And so whenever you learn any topic in Kirkasani, the reason why the book reaches 1,200 pages is he follows a very strict methodology of quoting all the sources he disagrees with, followed by his view. So just to start with an outline, we have Al-Bab al-Khamis wal-Khamsun. So the 55th chapter, you could see that here in the Roman numerals. So we are in the 10th of 14 chapters on the 55th subchapter. في ابتداء القول في تمامات الإنسان ورد على من لم يجبه في هذا العصر. So the beginning, this is just the beginning of my teaching on corpse impurity of humans. So there are multiple kinds of corpse impurity. There's corpses of animals and there are corpses of humans. وَرَدَ عَلَى مَنْ لَمْ يُجِبْهُ. And the response to those who do not obligate corpse impurity in this generation. And so we can get a few things from the chapter title. This is just the beginning of his teaching, and it's the response to those who don't obligate corpse impurity. So I'm guessing the majority of people in this room who are familiar with Jewish practice are aware of the lived experience that corpse impurity in a way exists. We read about it every year in the book of Leviticus. We study it in the order of Kodshim in rabbinic literature. And yet we also know that in a way it's not enforced. There's a funny lack of enforcement, which we'll get to briefly. And so when he's talking about people who don't obligate corpse impurity in the 10th century, what he's really talking about is people who don't believe that it's possible to transition from a state of corpse impurity to purity. And so this is a distinction that we will get to soon. So to continue in this outline before we'll look at it in greater depth, we'll see that Nemoy did us the courtesy of adding paragraph numbers to this argument, which in the manuscripts does not have any of these nice paragraph numbers. It's just, and it's also, Nemoy did us the courtesy of converting Hebrew words and expressions into Hebrew letters, when if we were looking at one of the manuscripts, this text would either be written in all Arabic characters, in which case a Hebrew word would be written in the same way we can sound a Hebrew word in English letters, it would be written in Arabic, or the whole text would be written in Hebrew letters. And so we would have the Arabic words written with their Hebrew equivalents. And this is more difficult because there are more Arabic letters than there are Hebrew letters. And so several Hebrew letters can represent multiple Arabic letters, but every Jew in the 10th century who was used to reading Hebrew, every Jew who was used to reading Arabic texts, reading Hebrew letters, would have no problem understanding from the context what a word meant. And even scholars, after a few years, you can get used to reading Arabic written in Hebrew letters. Although I personally find it much more enjoyable to read Arabic in Arabic letters, the way that Nemoy wrote it. But it's important to note that this is, in a way, not what the original text would look like. So we have in the first paragraph a summary of Anan's view. We talked about Anan at the beginning of today. And then we have a follow-up paragraph for a subgroup of Anan. So we're still talking about Anan, half a page. And then he continues discussing Anan. This is just presenting their view. In paragraph 4, he starts to talk about the Rabbinites, continues to talk about the Rabbinites in paragraph 5, continues to talk about the Rabbinites in paragraph 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Just trying to show how we're still in the introduction. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. I don't know how much people have spent time in yeshiva studying Jewish texts, but this is a very long text on one topic, especially from the 10th century, such an early date. And so 29 paragraphs later, we reach the end of the introduction until we get to the 56th subchapter, which is في الكلام في النضخ في اليوم الثالث والسابع. So we talked about corpse impurity has this 3rd and 7th day sprinkling. So he starts to talk about that 10 days later. And that conversation lasts us until page 1095. And then he goes into more of the subchapters of corpse impurity. And the point of this was to show that the intellectual culture that he's steeped in is very deep. And he believes the reason why he goes to this great length is he believes that it's necessary to prove the correctness of his view. I must first prove the incorrectness of my opponent's view. And I must present my opponent's view fairly and present their arguments for their view. And then I must very systematically take down each one of those arguments. And I thought I was going to save this till the end, but it's appropriate right now to share that this comes full circle very much with the first lecture, even before this series where I lectured on Rabbi Saadia Gaon. The reason why it's important to mention Rabbi Saadia Gaon is Saadia Gaon is really the first medieval Jew that we know who followed the strict method of quoting all of one's opponents, presenting their views fairly, and then systematically rejecting each of their opponent's views. And in a way, Kirkasani really adopts Rabbi Saadia Gaon's methodology and really uses it as a weapon against Saadia Gaon. And many of the most interesting discussions in Kirkasani are his lengthy citations of Saadia Gaon, followed by his lengthy rebuttals, point by point. And when I say point by point, I mean a 14-point argument in one case, very systematically dealing with each argument. And unfortunately, because Kirkasani's text was written about 10 years after Saadia Gaon, we lack a rebuttal of his rebuttal. So he always gets the last word in Kitab al-Anwar, not because Saadia Gaon wouldn't have had any response to these arguments, but simply because of chronology. And so unfortunately, the debate for the most part ends with Kirkasani. So to dive into this, I'll read the first paragraph. Okay. So now we're talking about Anan. And as we recall from last class, Anan is really the first and most important figure to break from the Talmudic tradition and the Gaonic Jewish tradition. And so what does Anan have to say about impurity? Inna Anan wa ashabahu asqatu tamamet fi hadha al-asr. So Anan and his companions canceled the laws of Tamamet in this generation. والعذي حاول صاحبهم عليه من الاحتجاج لذلك ما أخذه من مقادمات ربانيين في توراة كهانيم. This is very interesting. So Kirkasani says Anan himself defended his view. How did he defend his view? He defended his view from a principle that he took from Torah Kohanim. And if there are those in the audience who are familiar, Torah Kohanim is the nickname for the Sifra, which is perhaps after the Mishnah, the most important work of early rabbinic Judaism. And it's the rabbinic commentary on the book of Leviticus. And those familiar with the Jewish liturgy know that every morning in the Shachri prayer, there are those who say, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Shlosh Midot HaTorah. There are 13 hermeneutics by which the laws of the Torah are understood. And one of these hermeneutical principles is Gzera Shava. So what did Anan do? Anan, who we said last class, created a Talmud of his own, took the idea of Gzera Shava, and he applied it in the case of corpse impurity to argue the following. So Anan made a Gzera Shava, who qawl al-kitab, zot ha-Torah adam ki yamut ba'ol, kol ha-ba'olol. So he took this verse, and unfortunately, we lack the full argument. This is funny. So he says, وَقَدْ حَكَيْنَا ذَلِكَ عَنَّ فِي الْبَابِ الْعَاشِرِ مِنَ مَقَالَ الرَّابِعِ. So he says, and I already showed how this argument failed in the 4th chapter of the book. And so he's not going to repeat himself because I already talked about it 500 pages ago, how this argument failed. But what's very interesting about here is we see that Anan started this whole practice of using the rabbinic tools against them. And so we see here that we learn a little bit about Anan, that he was using things that he learned from the Sifra. And Kirkasani as well, if we were to study the 4th chapter, we would see that he goes through each of the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael. And in the case of Gzera Shava, which is, I apologize for not translating it, and one of the reasons is it's very hard to translate. Because the concept of Gzera Shava is difficult to translate, it's difficult to really understand or justify, Kirkasani actually says here, وَأَرَيْنَا فِي سَدْ قَالْهُ فِي مَعْ فِي سَدْ جُمْلَةِ الْبَابِ. He says, I already showed in the subchapter on Gzera Shava that the whole thing doesn't make any sense. And basically, the rabbinic hermeneutic of Gzera Shava has to do with if one word is found in one verse and the same word is found in another verse, then we can learn something from these two words. And Kirkasani basically shows that this is unsustainable. If we really took this principle seriously, we would come up with so many counterexamples, things that are ridiculous. And so really the whole concept of Gzera Shava is something that should be rejected. And so he's not going to repeat on that. There's no point in me going back and repeating this argument. And he continues. And so this is interesting because we're going to see that Anan, who was active in the 8th century, so he came up with one argument. And apparently it wasn't enough. How do we know it wasn't enough? Anan came up with this one argument. Well, he continues, فأما أهل النظر من أصحابنا فإنهم يعتمدون في الاستدلال على أن تمت ساقط في هذا العصر لأن مينيدا معدوم. So students of Anan, some time in the 200 years between Anan and Kirkasani, some of his students came up with another argument. And so the debate doesn't stop. Very healthy intellectual culture, and people apparently felt free to disagree with their teacher Anan, and they came up with another argument. And this argument is very interesting. This argument is that the ashes of the red heifer, which are used to be sprinkled on the corpse impure person on the 3rd and 7th day, are missing. And there can be no purification, no tahara, without the ashes of the red heifer. And therefore, وَإِذَا عَدَمَتْ الطَّهَارَةِ سَقَطَ التَّمَّ. If there can be no purification, then it must be, this is a logical argument, if there can be no purification, then there must be no impurity. So this is really a philosophical argument. They're saying if there's no impurity, they're saying if there's no way to become pure, it must be that there's no impure. Hold on to that. Hold on to that concept. Because we're going to go from the Ananites to the Rabbinites. And so the Ananites and the Rabbinites come to a similar point here, but very different. So let's look at this. I'm skipping over a third Ananite argument. So just to point out that the Ananites are themselves not a homogeneous group. Different members of the Ananite group had different arguments. They could disagree. We could talk more about their internal group dynamics. But when we get to the Rabbinite camp, we find something very interesting. فأما الرابنين فقد كنا حكينا عنهم أنهم يرون أن جميع الناس أتمياء في هذا العصر من المات. So the Rabbinites say that everyone in this generation is considered corpse impure. إذ كان ما به يكون الطهر الذي يمنيدا معدوما. And the reason is because we lack the mechanism for purification. The ashes of the red heifer are gone. And so rather than saying that there can be no impurity, they're saying that we're stuck in impurity. Everyone is considered corpse impure at all times. وَإِنْ ذَلِكَ أَلِحَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنْ قَالُوا. And so this gets summed up in a sort of motto from the Rabbinite community, which is in Hebrew, Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash in Tuma ve'in Tahara. From the day of the temple's destruction, there's no impurity or purity. And so this leads to a rather paradoxical conclusion for the Rabbinites, which is that everybody is always corpse impure. But in a way, by making everybody always corpse impure, there is the experience of nobody being impure. And this is what I would suggest. And so Kirkasani responds to this notion with a very unique take of his own. And so to get to that, we're going to skip forward to page 1090. And so after much discussion of the topic, we get to a very philosophical point, which seems like the time is going faster. I wish we had several more hours to carefully review all 29 paragraphs so you could really get a taste of what this is like. I should mention that this text was memorized. Even though it's written today and it was written then, it was written to be memorized, just like the books of rabbinic literature were memorized. And apparently, when you take away a smartphone and all the other distractions we have, the human mind is capable of memorizing very long texts. And we know that because this text, he talks about how we know how they would orally recite these texts. So unfortunately, we're not going to read the whole argument, but it really boils down to the opposite of the Rabbinite philosophy and the Annanite philosophy, which is that this Rabbinite view that we're all kind of in a Tuma purgatory, what I call Tuma purgatory. So Esther writes, would that be like Torah Shebaal Peh? It'd be exactly like Torah Shebaal Peh. So in the Gaonic period, at the time that we're talking about, even when the Talmud was written down, so the Talmud was orally written, we could say, around the 6th century, in the sense that it became like a completed text, but it was only written later. And even after it was written, it continued to be orally studied. And there are small pockets to this day where it's still orally studied. So what is the problem with this Rabbinite view? The problem is you enter what I call Tuma purgatory, where everybody is corpse impure, but there's no way out of it. And Kirkasani has a big problem with that. He has a big problem with that. And one of the main arguments is theological. This has to do with a philosophical belief that God would not put us into purgatory. It's kind of cruel, if you think about it. Corpse impurity is the worst kind of impurity. Why would God make us all corpse impure with no way out? And this really has to do with when we talked about the Islamic Renaissance, because the popular, and just like liberalism today, human rights, you could look at how we're all shaped in a way by liberal worldviews. And the time of Kirkasani, the popular philosophical school was called the Mu'tazila school. And this had to do with 5 basic principles that are found throughout not only Kirkasani, but Rabbi Saadia Gaon as well, as I discussed in the lecture on Saadia Gaon. And they have to do with this really strong belief in divine unity and justice. And there's really an injustice, according to Kirkasani, in the Rabbinite conclusion that we are trapped in Tuma purgatory, that we're all corpse impure. Now, I would repeat, just from my experience, in my experience growing up in a rabbinic community, that we all kind of know this view that, yeah, technically we're corpse impure, but there are no implications of it. And Kirkasani really believes that there ought to be implications, because corpse secure, just like when we talk about menstrual impurity, there are very severe implications of a woman being menstrually impure. And these are laws that are taken very seriously today by observant Jews. I'm going to go back to the presentation. And they were taken very seriously. They were taken even more seriously in the 10th century. and he talks about this, and I'll share a little bit of what he says because it shows that purity is a really it's a really ancient area of Jewish life. The most interesting example that Kirgasani mentions to show how ancient and how deeply ingrained purity and purity are in Jewish culture is that in Genesis 31, in the book of Genesis, even before the laws have been given at Sinai, we have Sarah, we have Rachel. I need to look at Genesis 31. Rachel says, I can't get up from the when she's being searched, the manner of woman is upon me. And so Kirgasani uses this to show that even before the law is given at Sinai, the concept of menstrual impurity already exists. And in the 10th century, this is taken very seriously to the point that a woman would separate from their husbands, sleep on a separate bed, separate clothes, separate utensils. And these are levels of stricture that, as far as I understand, are only practiced in the most, in certain Hasidic and Haredi communities. Some of these customs are continued to be practiced. And certain objects, earthenware vessels, once they touch this kind of impurity, they're destroyed or sold. It's very serious. And corpse impurity is much more serious in a way than menstrual impurity in the biblical system. And Kirgasani really has a hard time threading the needle that we're all corpse impure, so we're all the worst kind of impurity, and there's no way out of it. And yet, there is no real impurity after the temple has been destroyed. There's no real fix, and he thinks that's simply something that it's inconceivable that God would put us in such a position. And he also makes many textual arguments, and it really boils down to that the third and seventh day sprinklings of the meinida, of this substance made with the ashes of the red heifer, are only mandatory when there is a red heifer, so in the temple period. But after the temple period, there still is a process of purification. It's just a modified process, and it has to do with the 8th-day ablutions, the bathing. And this custom, this idea of Kirgasani, is continued in Karaite Judaism since the 10th century. And you can actually, if you're interested, look up online Karaite laws of corpse impurity. And I would suggest that really what's at issue between the Rabbinite view and the Karaite view is the sense of the corpse impurity be something real in the world. But just like we talked about the moon, seeing the moon, it's something we can all relate to. We can all see a moon being born and have a sort of sense that it's a new month. I see the new moon. And similarly, since I studied Kirgasani, I felt like when I see a corpse, in my case, it's only been animal corpses, I know that if I touch this corpse, something has changed in me. I've touched something that is the most impure. I read the Torah. I understand that a dead body is the most impure. And if I touch it, I need to do something to correct this action. I need to do some sort of washing. I need to go, for me at least, go to the beach, do something. I can't do nothing. It doesn't make any, it's hard for Kirgasani. And he advocated, and Karaites to this day practice the whole 7-day process. And in a way, this is an experience of Judaism that is makes the laws of Leviticus not something we read as museum artifacts, but that we don't actually deal with today, but as things that are a real living part of Jewish life. So this is very interesting. And just in the few minutes before questions, we'll talk about the communal implications of this. So Firstly, I should say we were talking about this in medieval Baghdad. So we want to note that purity is also a big topic in Islam, and there's striking similarities between the Islamic laws of impurity and the Jewish laws, and many have suggested that the Islamic tradition borrows from the Jewish tradition and then influences on the Jewish tradition of the medieval period. And it's very clear studying Kirkasani that the fact that the Jews are living in an Islamic empire, they're very aware of the Islamic laws and values and philosophical ideas, and they're very clearly responding and defending Judaism in light of their context. And the real communal implications of these debates over purity and impurity, the two biggest ones have to do with prayer and food. So everybody agrees that holy and unholy are not supposed to mix. And there, we could talk more about how the Rabbinites deal with this issue. Everybody agrees in the Torah there are very serious penalties for mixing up holy and unholy. The worst penalties that are in the punishment system are applicable for a person mixing holy and unholy. And so those who disagree with the Rabbinites would not pray together because their synagogues, if they're corpse impure and they're not doing purification because they don't believe purification is possible, this means that their synagogues are full of this worst impurity. And since we go to a synagogue to pray and do something that's holy, you can't mix the holy and the unholy. So those who disagree with the Rabbinite view of impurity will not pray in a Rabbinite synagogue. And so that leads to a clear communal fracture where the non-Rabbinites won't pray with the Rabbinites because they disagree with, they're basically putting corpse impurity everywhere because they're not doing anything to clean it up. And so it's infecting everything they touch. Whereas I'm speaking now from Kirkasani's perspective, we wash after it, we convince ourselves that we become pure, and we live in a state of purity, and we pray in a state of purity. And we're very careful to only pray with people who are also careful about their purity. And similarly, food. The Rabbinites mix up all this impurity in their dishes, and so we can't eat together. And who we would eat with is a very sensitive issue. You need to be careful about who you eat with, not only because of the standards of their kitchen and what food they consider kosher, which is a whole other discussion, but how they handled impurity. And this is to say nothing of the communal boundary between Jews and non-Jews, because there's a whole separate conversation about the impurity of non-Jews and of their food and of their holy spaces. And if anyone is feeling like there are undertones of Second Temple sectarianism of who do I pray with and who do I eat with, or if there are modern reverberations of the same question, who do I pray with, who do I eat with, who do I consider pure, who do I consider impure, it's because these are questions that continue to be relevant in every generation. And so I wanted to conclude by sharing that I found a rabbinic source that I'll just read quickly. It says that there are families today who have a custom of 40 or 80 days of not touching their wives after giving birth. And this is a Karaite custom of the heretics who desecrate the Torah. And it's a huge mitzvah, huge commandment to cancel this erroneous custom and to touch someone who's recently given birth after 1 week or 14 days. And so this goes to show that the medieval view of Karaism, the main group who opposed the rabbis, still has some residual force. And in a way, I would suggest that this rabbinite author makes a mistake by saying that 40 or 80 is a Karaite view. This author is missing the whole point, that it's really that the rabbinic view, somebody mentioned in the chat, medieval Baghdad in the 60s and 70s practiced this custom. I would suggest, I don't know this for a fact, that it probably has nothing to do with Karaism and everything to do with the biblical laws, and the fact that the Bible describes, the Torah describes 40 and 80, and this was not something that the Karaites invented. It was something that they returned to. And if we were to be in medieval Baghdad, there were probably many people who kept 40 and 80 simply because it's an ancient custom for 1,000 years, even before we get to the medieval period. This is a force of biblical law that continues to the present day. And for those who've had a difficult time relating to the book of Leviticus and to the laws of corpse impurity and menstrual impurity, I would like to offer the suggestion that the fundamental point of keeping the holy and the profane separate through the demarcation of sacred spaces, sacred times, rituals to perform, to reset our systems to get into a state of purity, that hopefully this is something that we can appreciate and bring into our Jewish practice, whether or not we agree with the Ananites or with the Rabbinites or with Al-Kirkasani. My intention is that by bringing these sources back, the takeaway is that we continue as links in the chain of this this debate that really begins in the biblical literature itself. If we had more time, we could get into that. The Bible is not homogeneous itself when it comes to impurity. There are different views on this within the Bible, and some of these tensions already present within biblical literature come back up in the 10th century. I didn't mention that the laws of impurity play a big part in the Jesus movement and his views on ritual impurity versus moral impurity. It's a subject for another debate series, and they resurfaced in the medieval period, and they resurfaced today, perhaps in less obvious ways. I'm not familiar with anyone trying to bring back the laws of corpse impurity, although I do believe in Israel there are those who are searching for the red heifer, because people feel, this is my projection, that there's something missing without corpse impurity. When we say that we're all corpse impure, but there's nothing to do about it, it's not the greatest landing point, because it's not good to be corpse impure. It's natural. It can happen by accident, but it's not a good thing to be in the worst form of impurity. And so I would understand the contemporary rabbinic attempt to find a red heifer to be able to be back in the process of purification. This is a longing for what Kirkasani advocated for, trying to get back to where Kirkasani has gotten to already 1,000 years ago, that really we want to be able to purify, because it's a commandment to purify. It's something that we can experience. For those who have a mikveh practice, for those who have a practice of going to bodies of water to mark rites of passage, rituals, you can experience that you feel different coming out of the mikveh. And anyone who touches the corpse, I presume, would also benefit from some sort of ritual to become pure. And when we say that you can't become pure, that there's real cost of that view. Someone writes, I'm amazed by the fact that many women have different lengths of time to menstruate. I think the understanding range of difference I'm being considered. Okay, interesting. And so we're out of time, but I'll stick around for any questions that people can feel free to put in the chat, or they can raise their hand and we can hear from you. This is a really good Jewish teaching. Thank you, John. So if anyone wants to adopt the practice of purification from corpse impurity, I think that even in a symbolic way, if you believe that technically there is no way without the ashes of the red heifer, that a symbolic practice can still be personally meaningful. Should we purchase the red heifers and use their ashes? I think that my personal view, Carmen Hacham as a raised hand, is that even if we can't do 100% of the corpse impurity process, it's still better to do something. Although if you take it seriously, Kirkasani takes it very seriously, you quickly find out that it becomes very complicated. And I think if we're being honest, one of the reasons why the Rabbinites get rid of all the corpse impure laws is because it becomes a whole Pandora's box. Corpse impurity is contagious. You start to contaminate your clothes, the things you touch. It becomes a whole nightmare. If you think Pesach cleaning is hard, try dealing with corpse impurity. And I think that there is real comfort for just getting rid of this hugely complicated and very serious body of biblical law. And at a certain point that things became too unmanageable, we kind of need to make this easier on ourselves. Life is short.